Hey guys, first of all, apologize, just getting over a little bit of a cold here. So my voice is a little bit groggy, so apologize for that. What I want to do in this video is just kind of talk about just more theory about how I approach sound mixing instead of, going through specific tasks, just because that would be a much longer video. So obviously the most important thing to any short film is going to be the dialogue. That's first and foremost, and that should always be your anchor point and foundation. I paid special attention to really get the best dialogue that I could on set. I used the Tentacle Sync hardware devices that help me keep time code accurate sync between the camera and my sound recorder. So that made it really easy to sync all that up. Typically what I always do, I'm always gonna go through the dialogue and just clean it up first. So I'll have just long tracks. And a lot of times, I'll do different things, but I like to kind of just parse it out, because inevitably there'll be lots of extraneous sound captured within the audio tracks that have stuff that you don't want. Because a lot of the sound for a film is all going to be redone. So sure, it might have captured some of the doors opening or some movements or this or that, but it doesn't sound distinct, it doesn't sound clear. I don't have the ability to mix it the way that I want, as opposed to adding those effects back in post, having fully recorded for the project as well. So again, typically I start with dialogue bites. My dialogue media here.
I said move the...
So I'll have, mixture of...
I said move the car onto the tracks.
I'll have my
I need a minute.
boom material. I'll have my lav material. Typically I'll, have my boom tracks on the first track, first tier. Then, below I'll probably have a lot of my lavs, again, using them for redundancy. They both kind of play a purpose, and I talk about that in a later video.
Please, I need a minute.
So kind of just use the boom or the lav to its strength. Obviously, as we're farther away from the camera, I'm relying on the lavs. The lavs here.
Get in.
And inevitably, when you're using a lav, it's going to be a lot more dry. It's not going to have as much warmth and character as you would with a boom mic. So typically, what I do with that, especially per the atmosphere, we're in this big kind of warehouse here. So I'll wet it up with some reverb. So I have different sends to reverb channels here. And I'll either use algorithmic or a convolution reverb. So typically a convolution reverb, it samples a real space. So I have the ability to basically create these different snapshots. So I have a warehouse, just a large space environment that I automate here in this plugin, that I wet up the dialogue, I wet up the footsteps, some of the different just prop movements in general, just to give that bigger, airier space. So that helps just adding reverb as I have here.
Get in.
As you can hear that a little bit right there. So this is with it out.
Get in.
So I add a lot just for effect.
Get in.
So just using it for taste. You never want to overuse reverb. A lot of times, I can even get carried away with it sometimes too. You don't want to overuse reverb where you can't distinctly hear the dialogue. That should always be the focus. In terms of just dialogue in general, a lot of times you're going to have noise. We live in a very noisy world. You might have refrigerators, AC units on, just very loud, distant drone of traffic in the background. So, what I typically use to nullify that, or at least deal with that issue, is Isotope RX6, which is an incredible plugin that has so many different modules that really help me make the best of audio from any type of production. So, I'll typically, take a just sample of noise where there's kind of just a clean section of noise. I'll hit learn, make certain parameters. I'll get a reading of that, and then ultimately I'll preview back, and then I'll adjust certain parameters, and then I can, listen to make sure that I'm only just taking out some of that redundant noise, but not pushing things too much where I'm actually affecting the quality of the voice. So, these plugins are absolutely wonderful. You can really take some problematic audio and do wonders with it, and really make it where it's usable and it's not distracting like it once was. But again, find a point of, tact. Don't overuse. So let's go ahead and move and just take a look at effects. So we typically have a certain amount of kind of food groups of sound. So we have the dialogue, we have Foley, which is typically the footsteps, cloth movement, prop interactions. Then we have hard effects or effects for this film, opening, shutting of doors, the engine sound, gunshot, what have you. And then we have backgrounds. So backgrounds create that environment that all these other sounds live in. So, I have an abandoned warehouse sound here, kind of just an eerie quality. Light, kind of distant traffic. Little fluorescent light buzz. And when it comes to sound, it's not about just throwing in just a plethora of all types of sounds and just having this clashing cacophony of backgrounds or hard effects or whatnot. It's better to spend more time and find a few really good sounds that add a lot to what you're doing, and just pinpoint, placing them in specific places for full effect. Another thing that really kind of can set you apart and what makes a soundtrack much more dynamic is cutting to scene perspectives. So as you see here, I A-B a lot of my tracks, A-B, A-B, A-B. And I do that to more dynamic perspective cuts. So outside to more inside, inside, farther away, wider shot here. So that gives me the ability to basically highlight certain tracks, put it into preview automation mode. Then I can go through, I can make adjustments for volume for that perspective change, maybe adding slightly different, room reverb, how much I apply automation that way. So you can just have subtle volume differences from inside to outside. All types of stuff like that. Backgrounds are never going to be, necessarily this like wow factor to your picture, but they're equally as important as crazy sound design is, because again, it just kind of sets that environment where all your other sounds live. Typically, I'll treat the dialogue, do a basic mix of that, because that's the relative point that everything else should be mixed to. And then I focus on cutting my backgrounds, because that creates the environment. And that inspires me to then, really find the right hard effects, make the right sound design choices, because I've created this real world, so to speak, that all these other sounds are living in. All right, talking more about effects. Again, with the same A-B thing, I do the same thing with specific effects. So, I have a car sound here playing. It's the same sound effect, but I EQ or use reverb, so the shot perspective, it feels right. So we're inside the car, outside the car now. I might deal with a sound that was recorded where it's really full range, but oftentimes, I might just EQ and roll off those high frequencies. That's a very easy trick to kind of create a natural sense of distance. Or if we're from an interior perspective, we have sounds from outside that are being, created or emanated from, but we're from the interior perspective, easy way to sell that is just to roll off those highs, because that's generally the lower frequency sounds will penetrate walls a lot easier than high frequency sounds. So a lot of times I'll do that with sound effects just to kind of sell that perspective. And when I do my scene cuts, I do a very meticulous, like half frame fade, okay? So instead of everything just like fading up and down, over a couple seconds, or just slapping sound effects in there that just go for the entire scene, all these little things are just creating subtle changes. Again, perspective, volume, reverb, what have you. So it's very accurate to those scene cuts. I remember when I was just starting out, I used to be super sloppy. I knew the general sense of, going from inside to a wide shot. It needs to sound different. It needs to feel like, this is a real place and it sounds like how it should sound. But I would have long fades and everything would be uneven. So it's really about being also just precise and organized with your sounds and how you cut and when you choose to cut them. And also with hard effects, a lot of times it's, the blending of very specific sounds to create that encompassing whole that you want. So I have a number of sounds here. Just subtle sound of car, mixed with just kind of exhaust loop, and then also tire gravel. So a lot of times, when it comes to sound, and people really don't have a grasp of how to go about it, a lot of times things will be very just one-dimensional, one plastered background sound effect, a few key sound effects here or there that are just awkwardly placed and just poorly cut in. And it just sounds that way. It's unengaging, it's uninteresting. So with sound, it should be multi-layered, backgrounds, all these attentions to details, how you cut them, the sounds that you choose, how you finesse it within the mix, just volume automation, subtle EQ, you can do so much with that just alone. Subtle things like a little just tires, squeal, just a little like suspension kind of hit.
Stop the car here.
Just lots of just these minute, subtle elements that just give more character to this old jalopy of a vehicle. Liven up what could be a much more kind of silent scene. If there's not as much dialogue, it really gives you a lot more room to play with your environmental sounds. In terms of the backgrounds, I have, subtle, distant dogs. So I'll take a clean dog recording that's very like up close and personal and distinct. And then I'll take, a certain reverb that I have, and, set certain parameters and basically just bake in that some reverb so it sounds now like that dog's really far away and has this unique kind of echoey aspect to it, And just these subtle things that, again, just make this environment more interesting. Moving on to another really important aspect to any type of film or video project is Foley. And so again, like I was saying, Foley is typically cloth movements, prop interactions, footsteps, what have you, things that aren't very easily, cut in by, a sound library. It's not going to have all that variation. Sound libraries are absolutely crucial. I use the Pro Sound Effects hybrid library, which you guys have a chance to win at the end of this season, the end of the 6 weeks. But sound effects, you know, it doesn't have the variety that a true Foley artist, you know, can bring to the table. Now, you know, for a lot of people, you guys aren't gonna have that, that option. There are really good sampler tools out there for footsteps I use with my keyboard a lot of times. You can do footsteps near, far, running, walking, even some cloth back and forth. So, you know, that would be a good thing to look into, using Native Instruments Contact and some different samplers to do that. I was lucky enough to have Martin from Buenos Aires and his team do the Foley for this. And it really adds so much. So, you know, I'll play this for you. You know, we have the leather jacket element. So we have that. We have some gun movement. Our footsteps. Adding in footsteps, adding in cloth rustle. To me, that's really what makes a short film or a soundtrack, or it makes that, like the on-screen actions, those characters, it makes them feel tangible. It really brings life into their performances. Otherwise, it just feels dry. You know, in real life, we're used to hearing some cloth movement, footsteps of our, you know, family, friends, or whatever. And recording that after the fact, that gives me, or give you, the ability to mix that in at the proper volume. You never want someone's, you know, in real life, you know, one might have heels that are crazy loud and that are actually distracting you from being able to hear them properly. But in post, we have the ability to tailor that volume exactly how we want it. So just have it at the level where you get the sense of it, you feel that, but it's never competing with the dialogue, and that's very, very important. As a sound effects editor or sound designer, a lot of times you have the opportunity to impart yourself and add something to a project that you know, the director might never have thought of before. But, you know, going through a scene, I might, you know, be inspired to add even just a very simple sound, but it can be really effective in nailing down a key story point so the audience gets something, or it really helps to motivate a character's action in a film that maybe wasn't as poignant before. So for example, this little stopwatch sound right before, you know, he looks at his wrist or watch or whatever, you know, smart device he has on there. You know, before, there's not as much, there's not a specific motivating factor, but just adding in this little beep sound here, you know, it just motivates a good reason for him looking at that. And, you know, Joel didn't think about that, and I just added a few little things in, and he had looked at it and heard what I'd done with this specific episode, and he was, oh, yes, I love that. That's great. But just certain subtle sounds that can reinforce a moment, you know, can help connect the dots for people. Going towards the end of this particular scene, you know, we kind of had the impending doom of a distant train coming, okay? So, you know, even just simple sounds like that really adds tension to the scene, you know? So just play it for a second. So I have a distant horn there.
I've got the energy, but
and just some
I don't think we have the time.
Train bells. So here's just a distant horn. Just really, really low volume, added just, you know, a lot more reverb on it just to sell that distance. Just enough where you can pretty much feel it more than hear the sound. And then just slowly kind of rising up the volume
I don't think we have
of this bell sound, train bell. Just slowly bringing it, making it a little bit louder as we go throughout the scene, just kind of adding that tension. Again, you know, the Foley prop movements and
on the train.
clothing rustle is really key in this little confrontation here.
What are you doing?
Again, it doesn't have to be the fanciest sounds ever, but just pay more attention to the sounds that you are picking. You know, I use this program here, which you guys have an opportunity to win, Basshead. It's great for ingesting all your sounds, to be able to find them, search for what you need, ingest it very easily into your project. So again, just be thinking more deeply about, you know, how you're acquiring the dialogue, making sure that's smooth, making sure there's nothing distracting that way, to really create a more immersive set of backgrounds, you know, cutting for perspectives, A, B, slight adjustment in volume, using EQ and reverb to the benefit of the project. You don't have to have the craziest set of tools, hardware, or ability to at least have, you know, something that's clean and enjoyable, something that's devoid of just rough cuts, you know, noisy this, noisy that, dialogue that's all over the place in volume. And you know, lastly, it's all about just the mix, you know, volume automation, you know, that's really huge. And just creating like an ebb and flow. A lot of times, you know, with my sound effects, you know, I like to have, especially places that motivate that, very just kind of more quiet, quiet moments where there's not as much sound. So then for the more dramatic parts, I can push the volume levels a little bit more, and it's more impactful instead of always pushing, barraging your audience with just loud sound after loud sound. You know, in many ways, it's like an orchestra. You know, you're very much orchestrating the emotions, the impact that the audience is going to feel.